Welcome, everyone. My name is Angela Sultana from the YWCA Canada. I want to first extend a happy welcome to all of you from wherever you're calling in from. We're going to get started right now, and we encourage everyone. Right now, we're in webinar only mode, so you will have the opportunity to see the session, but there won't be the ability to speak in case you're wondering. And what I'll do first is I'll pass it over to my co-host, Hawa, from FAFIA. Over to you.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're calling in from. My name is Hawa, and I'm the Executive Director at the Canadian Feminist Alliance for International Action, also known as FAFIA, for those of you who know. FAFIA was founded after the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995, and it's a coalition of women's organizations across the country. Our mandate is really to defend the human rights of women in Canada and to advance women's equality through the implementation of Canada's international human rights commitments. As we welcome you here today and as we gather virtually from different parts of Canada, we acknowledge that the location of FAFIA's office is on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. We recognize both our responsibility and our obligation to the Algonquin people, on whose traditional territory we work, learn, and live. Providing land acknowledgement is more than simply just saying a land acknowledgement. It's also an understanding that the processes of colonization that have removed me and my family from our lands 25 years ago are the same processes that I'm complicit in upon this land now. There are also complex relationships between different groups of people depending on where you're from. So we also acknowledge all treaty people, including those who came here as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or in generations past, and those who also came here involuntarily. So particularly those who were forcefully displaced as Africans brought here as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. And again, this is important because our relationships to this land are complex. Our relationships to settler colonialism are also complex. And it's in that complexity that we could perhaps build some solidarity together. On December 10th, 2020, the YWCA and FAFIA worked together to commemorate International Human Rights Day by releasing a special chapter. This chapter was really intended to provide a human rights framing of key issues that had been raised in the YWCA Engaged Feminist Economic Recovery Plan on July 28, 2020. Part of that partnership also includes this. So welcome everybody again. It's a co-hosted panel by the YWCA and FAFIA to look at gender equity advocacy in Canada through a human rights lens. So we are absolutely in for a treat. I, for one, look forward to learning from these incredible and amazing speakers. So thank you for joining us here today. It's a pleasure getting to spend the next couple of hours learning from all of you. And so I'm going to shift it over to Anjum, who will be our moderator for today, and she'll go into introducing our speakers and panelists.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hawa. And I must say it's been such a pleasure from YWCA's end to collaborate with FAFIA, and we look to future collaborations and continue to amplify these conversations about human rights, gender equity as it relates to COVID-19 recovery and beyond. So it's been such a pleasure. One of the things I wanted to share before I get into the introductions of our presenting partners and panelists is some housekeeping around how to engage today. What I would encourage people to do is to ask questions throughout the session. We will have a Q&A at the end, so we'll take a look through the questions that come through. And so we encourage you to also, throughout the event, tweet. You'll see that we've included hashtags as well as for our panelists, their Twitter handles. So you're welcome to also share this information broadly as well. Currently, we are recording this session, so we are capturing this content, and ideally we'll have it for available use. We once again thank everyone for joining. We've actually had close to 500, and I think last I checked, over 500 people register. So really shows how exciting this topic is for many people, and also how much appetite there is to learn more about this topic. So I also want to take this moment to thank our presenting partners. We've had so many incredible organizations support this event, and this event would not have been possible without their kind support and promotion, as well as just generally ensuring that this event is as successful as possible. So the first organization is LEAF. So the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund works to advance substantive equality rights of women and girls through litigation, law reform, and public education. Since 1985, LEAF has intervened in landmark cases that have advanced equality in Canada, helping to prevent violence, eliminate discrimination in the workplace, provide better maternity benefits, pay equity, and access to reproductive freedom. So many of the topics we're talking about around the intersection of gender equity and human rights, LEAF is very familiar, so we thank them for their support. We also receive support from the National Association of Women in the Law, which is a not-for-profit feminist organization founded in 1974 that promotes the equality rights of women through legal education, research, and law reform advocacy. NAL writes briefs and discussion papers and appears before parliamentary and Senate committees and meets with decision makers to influence the lawmaking process on current and emerging feminist law reform priorities. I know for myself, NAL has been an incredible source of subject matter expertise as we talk about some of these pressing issues, especially when it comes to briefs. For example, the recent consultations around the Divorce Act. So it's been such a pleasure to work with NAL in the past and also receive their support for this event. Finally, we were also supported by West Coast LEAF. West Coast LEAF envisions an equal and just society for all women and people who experience gender-based discrimination. In collaboration with community, we use litigation, law reform, and public legal education to seek change. Some of the areas that West Coast LEAF focuses on is access to healthcare, access to justice, economic security, freedom from gender-based violence, justice for those who are criminalized, and the right to parent. And throughout this conversation today, I imagine many of these same topics will come up. So again, thank you very much to West Coast LEAF. So without further ado, I'll be introducing our first panelist. And the way that we'll be doing this conversation today is each panelist will be introduced and they'll be asked a question and they'll share. And then the next round, we'll actually go into the full panel discussion with everyone discussing at the same time. So first, without further ado, I'm really grateful to have Angela Marie Mcdougall be part of our session today. Angela is the Executive Director of Battered Women's Support Services and also is currently a member of the Ministerial Advisory Council on Gender-Based Violence. We also have worked with Angela through her incredible leadership at Feminists Deliver as both a founding member and as a co-chair of this fantastic organization. And they've been doing really important, urgent work addressing gender inequities and addressing the needs of marginalized communities in the province of British Columbia. And one of the things that has been most promising and just encouraging has been the incredible leadership that Feminists Deliver has done around talking about a feminist economic recovery plan in the province of British Columbia. So we're here, we've seen the incredible mobilizing in action and looking forward to hearing more from Angela's perspective on those issues. So Angela, the first question, yes, thank you again for joining us today. The first question that we have here is around what has been called the shadow pandemic. The UN has called it a shadow pandemic, gender-based violence. We know in Canada, gender-based violence has increased anywhere from 20 to 30%. And in many community-based organizations, you know, it's been even more than that. And this is often referred to as one of the most pervasive human rights violations in the world. From your perspective and through your work at Feminists Deliver and beyond, you've seen how important it is to address gender-based violence in COVID recovery, especially in economic recovery. Oftentimes we don't hear those conversations, but your organization has been really shining a light on it. I guess from your perspective, what needs to be done to systemically address gender-based violence, and where do you see opportunities to ensure appropriate human rights response to this crisis?
Thank you, Angela. Thank you so much. And thank you to the YWCA Canada and FAFIA for the opportunity to join today. I am here in these unceded ancestral and unsurrendered ancestral territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam people. And I was really encouraged by the opportunity to talk about gender-based violence, and with respect to human rights and what we are calling the COVID recovery. I always find that term interesting because, of course, we don't want to go back to where we were. And sometimes the notion of recovery, unless we give some caveats, could imply that. But I really want to talk about gender-based violence vis-a-vis human rights and COVID, in part because framing gender-based violence as a human rights violation really does imply how important a conceptual shift this is, and recognizing that gender-based violence is not accidental. It doesn't just come out of anywhere. It actually is rooted deeply in the structures and in through discrimination and in the very making of Canada as a nation through the role of colonization. And what we have is white supremacist patriarchal patriarchy as the law of the land. And right now, under COVID, it should not be a surprise to anybody if we understand that white supremacist patriarchy is the law of the land and so embedded in the structures. Then we would then see all of the horrific experiences that people all across these lands have dealt with under COVID, with the increased isolation, with just really giving so much power to an abusive partner through intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and sexualized violence. And so, we've been saying this for at least 40 years, I suspect, but the preventing and addressing gender-based violence is not a charitable act. Like, this is actually a legal and moral obligation. And we haven't seen, though we see pockets of engagement, with government here and there. And this is not to diminish those pockets of engagement because they actually do matter, but it has not become, the kind of institutional structural approach to policy and approach to how Canada is doing business. And we see this most definitely because, we had a very comprehensive national inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which, as with many reports that Canada has done to look at the inequities, is sitting on the shelf collecting dust. And we're getting ready to organize for the February 14th Women's Memorial March here in Vancouver, which is a march that's been organizing around disappearances and killings of women, primarily Indigenous women. We've been doing this since 1992. And, we've seen very little impact, and COVID has really just exacerbated that exponentially. And so what do we need going forward? We actually need the kind of engagement that we didn't have before. So we continue to do that work. There's so much to address structurally with respect to the inequities that are, we have to talk that there is no universal woman. And most of what we've done around feminism is from the point of view that there's one woman. And that is defaulted to a white supremacist ideology that is, again, the law of the land. So it's urgent now it was always urgent, but it's urgent now to entrench intersectional approaches. And Howa at the top talked about what some of that is, just in terms of land acknowledgement. And there's so much more. So Canada has to prioritize in ways it's never done gender equity from an intersectional frame, and your report at the YWCA Canada has been vital in that. And so, we did a report for here in British Columbia, but we're nowhere near yet. We're still scratching at the edges. And so let's continue that. We continue to resist every day and to take action on the front line.
That's great, Angela. And I'm encouraged and cautiously optimistic about that addressing of gender-based violence through some of the work that we're seeing around a national action plan. This is something activists have been calling for nearly decades, if not more. And this is something the UN has called on Canada since 2015.
Yes.
So hopefully this year we'll actually see some transformational change or more change than in the past.
We have to loop back on this, Angela, because as you know, we're getting ready to do community engagement all across the land. So this is going to be a vital thing for us to loop back on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Next, I'd like to call on and introduce Kasari Govender. Kasari is British Columbia's first independent human rights commissioner and came into the role on September 3rd, 2019. Her role is to lead the promotion and protection of human rights in British Columbia through the Office of Human Rights Commissioner. And for many years, Kasari was part of West Coast Leap, one of our presenting partners from 2008 until 2019, and was appointed executive director in 2011. Kasari has a law degree from the University of Victoria and her master's degree in international human rights law from the University of Oxford. And I will say this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the incredible contributions that Kasari has made in the field of human rights and beyond. So thank you very much, Kasari, for joining us today. And we're really grateful to have you participate.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the introduction.
Amazing. I guess, one of the questions that we have, given your role and also your role in institutions in the past, institutions have played a fundamental role in advancing human rights here in Canada and beyond. And I'm wondering, through your vantage point as the first independent human rights commissioner in the province of British Columbia, you've talked about in previous engagements around the importance of disaggregated data. Wondering from your perspective, how can such data collection be vital to COVID recovery and advancing human rights? And what other things can institutions do to advance a human rights approach?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you again for the invitation. I just want to start before launching into the answer by acknowledging that I am on unceded and traditional homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in what is now known as Vancouver. I do want to take this time to talk about data in particular. I think I'll just focus specifically on that piece of the question. The collection of race-based and other disaggregated data, I think, does have particular urgency in this moment. The pandemic, as we know, has exacerbated and exposed existing social inequalities, deep social inequalities. And there are far-reaching human rights implications of what we are experiencing now. Just so we're all on the same page, when I'm talking about disaggregated data, I'm talking about the collection of information about various aspects of our identities and subcategories of that information. So for example, by ethnic group, by occupation, by educational status, the kind of forms that we've all had experience filling out about our gender and race. And unlike aggregated data, which groups information together in a somewhat obscuring way, disaggregated data parses out information in a way that can reveal inequalities. I think the language of data is uniquely positioned as a tool to make change. It's certainly just one tool in a much larger toolbox, but it is an important tool because it's a tool that I think can really speak in a language that those in power, those making policy and law decisions can understand. When our policies are predicated on information, on data, the absence of that data can literally cost human lives. And I think that's part of what we're seeing and part of the urgency right now in the context of COVID. There's an interesting example from LA where disaggregated data on the basis of race, age, and some other factors, socioeconomic positions, have been used to expand culturally competent testing so language and culturally competent testing in LA County. And has been used to try to implement strategies for both identifying where COVID hotspots are, but also dealing with prevention in the context particularly of African-American, the way they've described it, African-American, Latino, Native Hawaiian, and other Pacific Islander populations. So those were the particular groups that they were trying to target. So it's a good example of how this data can be used in this moment. In September of this year, my office released a report called Disaggregated Demographic Data Collection in BC, the Grandmother Perspective. And this report talks about our findings in relation to data, both in relation to COVID, but also more generally, why it's important for social change and human rights work, but also importantly, how to guard against some of the risks of collecting that data, because there are significant risks. We talked to a number of people, did a lot of consultation in the process of this report, and heard loud and clear that colorblind and genderblind approaches to public policy and health policy in particular are not working, and in fact are deepening inequalities. But as I say, there are a number of risks. So we have to ensure that in collecting that data, institutions are doing it, governments are doing it in a responsible way so that they don't end up reinforcing problematic biases and stigma. So we heard about, in our consultations, we heard about some of the very real risks of collecting this data from really instituting racism, institutionalizing racism, Japanese internment, apartheid South Africa, the Indian Act, and the reserve system and residential school system here in Canada. These are all systems that were based on race-based data. So huge dangers for doing this work. Stigma is another important example of what can go wrong with collecting this data. Those of you from out west might be aware, and maybe others in the country, that there's an unfolding situation on Cowichan land on Vancouver Island, where the Cowichan tribes released some information about a COVID outbreak in their community, and the onslaught of racism that members of that community faced immediately by being shut out of public services, being shut out, or services, I should say, in the community, being shut out of stores, and so on the basis of their belonging to that community. It was immediate, that response. So really illustrates the risks of this kind of data. And so in our report, we talked about a few ways to combat that stigma. And I think it's really important that as institutions and as governments start collecting this information in COVID and beyond, that we take into account these steps to ensure that we don't increase stigma. So one of them is to ensure that data is always collected for the purpose of human rights, of systemic equality, and that if it's not collected in that purpose, we do not collect it. That's where the grandmother perspective comes in, that we collect data not from the perspective of a big brother, but from a grandmother caring for her community. And we were gifted that perspective from a woman named Gwen Phillips, who is an Indigenous leader in this province, working on data collection issues. We need to ensure that data has as much community ownership and control as possible, so far beyond just a consultative model, but to actually have governance built in. And we've made some recommendations specifically around how to build that into legislation. So in summary, I think disaggregated data is essential to equitable COVID response, because and responses will not be tailored to the needs of those who most need it, those who are most marginalized in our communities, unless we have the data to support that. We need that essential information to avoid running the risk of re-perpetuating the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic on marginalized people if we take these kind of colorblind and genderblind approaches. I see that there's a question about where to find our report. It's on our website and bchumanrights.ca. It's right in one of the banners. So if you just wait till the right banner scrolls across, you'll find it there, or you can look under the resource tab on our website. I encourage you to look at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate both the description of not only the power that disaggregated data has, but the very real risks if there's not ethical oversight and governance and community ownership, as you've mentioned. I actually come from a public health background, and one of the conversation points in my province, and I imagine in other jurisdictions across Canada, has been around disaggregated data as it leads to pandemic response. And, in my province of Ontario, there's a lot of resistance to that, but now we're starting to see that data collection, but it didn't happen without communities mobilizing and demanding it, but then also organizations saying, and community-led organizations saying, we want to be actually part of the decision-making process around this data. So I'm hopeful maybe one of the legacies of this pandemic will be broader adoption of not only disaggregated data collection, but also the governance that you've articulated, and also the grandmother perspective. That's something I haven't heard before. So I really look forward to reading the report and learning more. So thank you so much, Kasari. Absolutely. Next, we have such incredible leaders on this panel. So I'm really, really excited to also hear from our next leader, who is Michèle Biss. And Michèle, I've known for about, I think like now 2 years, but I feel like the time has just flown by. Michèle currently is the project manager of the National Right to Housing Network, a group of over 300 individuals and organizations who are dedicated to the meaningful implementation of the right to housing in Canada, and have done such incredible work around legislation related to this, but also increasing public awareness. Everywhere across the country, people are talking about the right to housing, and this community, this network in particular has been transformational for that broader public understanding. As an expert in economic and social rights, Michèle has presented at several United Nations treaty body reviews and at Canadian parliamentary committees. I believe that's actually maybe one of the first times that I met you. Prior to her work at the National Right to Housing Network, Michèle was a policy director and human rights lawyer at Canada Without Poverty. She is a human rights lawyer and was called to the Ontario Bar in 2014. Welcome, Michèle.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here among these panelists.
And we are delighted as well to have you here. And, kind of speaking to some of the work that you're doing right now, I wanted to ask your perspective on, as a country, Canada has signed on to many commitments related to human rights, whether it's the right to housing, health, food, economic, and social security, and generally many human rights treaties related to an adequate standard of living. In your opinion, and in the work that you do, does Canada have the appropriate legal and policy infrastructure to fulfill these commitments? And taking the National Housing Strategy as an example, a National Housing Strategy Act, there is the right to housing as a fundamental right. What has been the progress to date, and where do we go next?
So I'll start by saying that I am joining this amazing panel from the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. I think it's particularly relevant to bring that up because I'm very close to the seat of power for the federal government, where historically and currently so many laws, policies, and programs are implemented that don't respect the rights, particularly of Indigenous persons, but also of many other marginalized groups. It's interesting because if you had asked me this question, Anjum, before June of 2019, I would have had a very different answer. I would have said conclusively, Canada does not, resoundingly, I would have said Canada does not have the legal infrastructure for people to be able to exercise economic and social rights like the right to housing. But in June of 2019, there was a pretty significant shift when Canada passed the National Housing Strategy Act. And this was part of a long fight for economic and social rights to be recognized for many, many decades. And this is important because although Canada has committed to both civil and political rights, like the right to vote, freedom of assembly, we've also committed in international human rights treaties to economic and social rights, like the right to housing, the right to health, the right to food. And so for so long, though, it's been the case that people who have experienced violations of economic and social rights, like the right to housing, just have nowhere to claim those rights. Where do you go? Where do you go when you don't have laws, policies, and programs that are progressively realizing the right to housing? And that has been such a major barrier. In June of 2019, though, there was this big shift when we saw the passing of the National Housing Strategy Act. And it's important to note that in the language of the act, there's recognition that it is an articulation of the right to housing as it is found in international human rights laws, like the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which means that we can use international human rights jurisprudence, we can use authorities that have come from the UN to really figure out, what does that mean for Canada? What does it mean to do the right to housing? And how does that change the way that we're thinking about the creation of law, policy, and programs, where the gaps are, and how much we need to prioritize action? Really critically, for those who might know of the National Housing Strategy Act, there are two pieces to the way that people can now claim rights, two primary mechanisms. First is the advocate. Now, the advocate is yet to be appointed. They're working right now on the appointment process. But once we have a federal housing advocate, they'll have the opportunity to hear systemic claims related to the right to housing, investigate, and then issue recommendations. The Minister of Families, Children, and Social Development then has to respond to those recommendations within 120 days. And then they also have the ability to ask what is now being formed. And in fact, I think the very first meeting is happening today of the National Housing Council. They can ask them to form a review panel. And that review panel is going to be a body of 3 people, including persons with lived experience of homelessness and lived experience of housing need, as well as right to housing experts. And at that panel, rights claimants will have a chance to talk about these systemic issues. From there, we'll see recommendations. And then the minister has to respond again within, I believe, 120 days. And interestingly, that response has to be tabled then at the House of Commons and the Senate. And there's a lot of power in that. There's a lot of potential. I have a lot of hope in these systems. But what is so deeply important is that we monitor the creation of these new systems, and we build a space of systemic cases so that people actually trust them. There are so many ways that this could go badly. There are so many ways that this could become an advisory body, something that has a very soft amount of power to really push this federal government to thinking about the issues related to housing under the right to housing. And just to give a couple of really concrete answers, or answers to the question of what does this actually mean? I find I get that question a lot. I think the right to housing and human rights can seem really macro. And the right to housing, if we use that approach, if we see these sort of claims coming forward, we could see this really transform the way we're having conversations about things like the way that we prioritize investments in the National Housing Strategy to make sure that actually 25% of investments are impacting women, children, and girls. It can change the way that social housing providers are communicating, for example, with child welfare agencies when a woman is being told that she can't have her kids back because she needs a 2-bedroom unit, and social housing is saying you can't have a 2-bedroom unit until you get your kids back. And it changes the way that we prioritize ending homelessness for women who are often experiencing that in a way that's hidden. So these are really exciting new mechanisms, but it's really up to us to make sure that they are done well and done as a human rights mechanism.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciated just highlighting how this mechanism would actually work. I think for a lot of folks who are tuning in today, I think that was just really helpful in terms of just, we talk a lot about human rights in the abstract, but I think, this mechanism ensures that not only is it a right in name, but it's a right in practice and it's actually enforceable. So thank you so much for sharing what has been done so far and where we need to go next. I look forward to delving a bit deeper in part of the Q&A and further discussion. Next, I want to introduce Faye Faraday, who is a social justice lawyer, strategic advisor, policy consultant, and an academic whose work focuses on constitutional law and Charter of Rights and Freedoms, human rights, labor, employment, pay equity, employment equity, and many, many issues. And I think one of the things I just want to highlight as well is the incredible leadership that Faye has done with the Equal Pay Coalition and some of the organizing that has been happening throughout this pandemic and really mobilizing with also the recognition of the 50th anniversary of the Commission on the Status of Women. And one of the things that we've also had the privilege of hearing from Faye in the past is around some of the issues that are becoming really salient during this pandemic, which is around paid sick leave, which is around workers' rights, especially the rights of migrant workers. Faye is also an assistant professor at Osgoode Hall Law School, where she teaches in the areas of social and economic justice, labor, employment, transnational labor migration, human rights, ethical lawyering, advocacy and social justice and political activism. So there's many issues that we can delve in deeper. So I'm really excited to have you here, Faye, with us today. Great. So the first, absolutely. So one of the pieces that we wanted to ask you and get your perspective on is with COVID-19. We've seen, the economic and human rights disparities and injustices really come to the forefront and be revealed. One of which is around the disproportionate impact on Black women, Indigenous women, racialized women, newcomer women, 2S LGBTQ communities, and women living with disabilities, particularly around workplace or labor market participation. So having justice in the workplace. One of the things that we're seeing, especially in the last number of weeks and months, has been around increased desire around paid sick leave, for example, and greater justice in the workplace, because we're seeing the communities who have faced precarity in the workplace are also seeing the public health injustices during this pandemic. From your perspective, what are some of the pressing issues when it comes to economic security and human rights from that perspective?
Thanks very much, Anjum. There's a lot in that question. I'm joining you today from Toronto, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Huron. And I think that being really conscious of that history, as all of our speakers have said, is so important because it the inequalities that we're talking about are baked in from the beginning of this state. And when we look at what is happening with COVID and what is being revealed by COVID, it is all the structural inequalities that have pre-existed that, communities of racialized people, Indigenous people, Black communities, people with disabilities have always known were there. Nothing's changed. Everybody can now see it, is the difference. And I think the most serious challenge to having a real experience of human rights and economic security is the fact that our economic system, our political system, our legal system is not geared towards actually realizing those rights. It is built to deliver on metrics that have nothing to do with human well-being. Right? Everything in our economy is focused around maximizing profit, not being attentive to the well-being and lives of people. And paid sick leave is one of those most obvious things, right? It was something that we did have under the Employment Standards Act very briefly before the present Ontario government repealed it as one of their first acts as a new government. But it's just a no-brainer that without paid sick leave, people who are poor cannot stay home from work when they're sick. And what you get instead is a demonizing of impoverished communities because they are not staying home, because they live in multifamily residences. And we're told, no, paid sick days is too expensive. And, so what you've got there is a really obvious clash between what is an absolutely pressing public health emergency, something that is absolutely uncontroverted and is backed by not just labor advocates, not just medical practitioners, not just smart business people themselves, but it's just a no-brainer that this is something you have to do, and yet we can't get it, right? So the things that we say publicly in our narratives are the things that we value are not. And one of the things I was involved with last year, early on in the pandemic, is that I wrote a report with the Canadian Women's Foundation, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and the Ontario Nonprofit Network called Resetting Normal, which is very much about shifting that gap between what we say we believe in and what actually exists. And we look at if you look at what's happening during COVID and the things that we say are essential, are all those jobs that women, racialized folks, people with disabilities, immigrant and migrant communities have been doing forever in conditions of indecent work, are all of a sudden being told that they're essential, but are not being given the protections, not being given the rights, not being given decent pay or secure jobs. And unless there's a fundamental shift in how we measure economic well-being, that is never going to change, right? What we've emphasized here is that it's not like we don't know the information or the solutions. You mentioned that in December, we marked the 50th anniversary of the report on the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. One of the main recommendations in that report was that we implement and develop a national childcare strategy. 50 years later, we still don't have it. It's still the most obvious need for ensuring women's economic participation. What we have instead is a doubling down on the double and triple burden that women are carrying during the pandemic, with the result that women are withdrawing in the hundreds of thousands, literally the hundreds of thousands, from the Canadian labor market. And the rate of women's participation in the economy now is the lowest that it's been in 2 generations. And unless there's a fundamental shift, that's going to take generations to recover from. I could go on for much longer. What I'll do is I'll save a number of my other comments for the second round of questions, but in the meantime, I will put a link in the chat to the Resetting Normal report.
That's great. Thank you, Faye. And it was such an incredible report to read. And I think really highlights also just the importance of the care economy, the series of reports and your work in particular. That's great. So now that we've had each of our panelists share a bit, I've just stopped the screen share so we can see everyone all at once. I actually want to go into some of the topics raised. And, so far we have leaders here who've worked on human rights issues as it relates to gender-based violence, as it relates to housing and homelessness, as it relates to economic security and labor rights. And we've also heard a lot about different tactics that we as members of civil society, the public, the government can take on and really push, whether it's building increased public awareness or collecting disaggregated data, or actually not only passing legislation and starting to build the infrastructure, but actually enforcing that human rights, that the human rights that we all are entitled to. so we have kind of seen the entire spectrum of what we can do around human rights. The next question, I open it to everyone, so whoever wants to answer first, you can. Right now we talk a big game about human rights, but how do we actually take it over the line and actually ensure that human rights are not just in principle, but are actually enforced? What do you see as the challenge and really making human rights something that lives and breathes? I open it up to the floor if anyone wants to kind of chime in first.
I'd be happy to chime in. I know I just spoke, but it sort of carries on very directly from what I was saying before. And where we are right now is that we have a social, economic, and political system that is focused on making profit for the few at the expense of the many. That is how it works. So the more you produce, the more profit there is. That is what's measured. But if we actually, and I think the challenge is that it's hard for people to see what a different system would look like because we're so immersed in it. But if you actually articulate what are the metrics that matter, if you're measuring what is a good life, they would be very different. They would be things like, yes, economic standards would continue to be relevant, of course, because you need a certain amount in order to survive and have sufficiency. But you'd measure things like, do you have access to education, and not just formal education, but access to intellectual and creative stimulation that keeps you engaged? Do you have access to health in a really deep and meaningful way? What is your time use like? What is the health of the environment? What is the vitality of your community? What is your psychological well-being like? What is the health of cultures and languages? Do you have good governance? All of those things would matter. And most of those are not about profit, but we're not measuring the things that matter. There are many other schools of economics that are focused on measuring human well-being. And until we actually start doing that, we're just going to be perpetuating the system that we have, because right now with human rights, the assumption is that we already have that as a baseline, and any deviation from it is some aberration. But what you're doing is just putting tiny individual band-aids on a system that is perpetually recreating and generating the exact same harms. So unless you change that system, you're going nowhere. But the good thing is that there are other metrics, and we just need to demand them and use them. And like New Zealand is doing that in its well-being budget. These are things that are possible. There just has to be the political will.
That's great, Faye. And I'm glad you mentioned budget and just measuring what matters. Just to kind of put it out there, we have an upcoming federal budget that is going to be coming out in a couple weeks, couple months. And this would be the first federal budget since the pandemic started. So there's a real policy window right now around really changing what we invest in, changing how we measure success. There was a conversation by Minister Freeland, our Minister of Finance, around using things other than just GDP to think about investment, looking at, for example, employment rates, looking at other types of guardrails, if you will. So it seems that there's an opportune time to insert, the types of metrics we should have. And I guess I'll also just put out there for everyone's consideration, we may also potentially have a federal election this year. Right. And I think there's a lot of conversation. Will it happen in the spring? Will it happen in the fall? Will it happen at all? But how do we leverage that? So I put that out there if anyone wants to take that on too.
I take a lot of leadership and insight into community-based responses and community-based organizing. And what most of the conversations that we're having right now have been largely driven as a result of community-based initiatives and resistance to power structures and the way that they exist in Canada. And I still, when I think about human rights and how we move forward, and even around electoral political activities, we really, because we're talking about human issues, social problems and rights, the leadership from community continues to be vital. And I think right now, and you said it when, earlier, Anjum, was the possibility of us having a national plan to address gender-based violence, and the community engagement piece on all kinds of levels is I know that something that is happening right now across the land. But what we continue to struggle with, and when I think about gender-based violence, which is what I want to talk about here today. And I mentioned it, and perhaps it becomes a throwaway line in effect. But we have a national plan to address gender-based violence from the point of view of Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people, which Canada is not taking action on. And all of the human rights issues that we've discussed here today are embedded in that plan. And it is foundational to redressing all of these inequities and the human rights violations that we have, is this reality of a sin against Indigenous people, the daily human rights violations against Indigenous people specifically. So this is something that I think we cannot ignore or see siloed off into the ministry that is dedicated for Indigenous people. This cross-sects every aspect that we discussed here today. And that report and that process, which I had the privilege to be a part of, the national inquiry into the disappearances and killings of Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people, revealed so much truth. And so the amount of information from survivors, families, scholars, Indigenous scholars, activists, leaders, activists from all across the land is unprecedented in information. And it lays out quite plainly the source of the problem, the way the structures exist in Canada, and the solution, which some of those have been that have been here today. So what I think is vital in moving ahead is, how do we, and I don't know if any of us are Indigenous to these territories, and I know that for us that may have been brought here against our will to these lands, we have our own relationship to, our ancestors have our own relationship to these lands particularly, but we have to not let Canada off the hook with respect to addressing that report and all of the recommendations that are embedded in that, which really, as I said, and I'll say it again, is the map for how we redress these human rights violations and how we advance human rights in terms of gender equity across these lands.
And I appreciate that so much, because in many ways, we don't need to create new things. There's a lot of existing reports, recommendations, community insight. And in fact, communities may also be frustrated by the fact that what people have been saying for generations is not being taken up. And so it's really incumbent on us to take what has already been generously shared and carry that forward. So well, really,
if I may, Angela, just one thing about that is, and this is the part that's really important, because I think sometimes in our organizing around feminist activism, we are holding the piece on Indigenous women as a silo. And I think that is something that all of us, I think, need to really look at, because it's not just like all the reports. This is a report that is a very long and yearly consultation that outlines the problem at the root and the solution. So the other reports are all great, but and we can add that, but this is a foundational document for our particular kind of organizing that we want to do, and the redress that we want to have to with respect to human rights in Canada.
Yeah, Agreed. A very important point, and something I'll definitely internalize and push forward as well. I appreciate that. I see that there are a few questions in the Q&A and chat, and there's one I think fits very well, Kasari, from some of the pieces that you mentioned around disaggregated data, and one around housing. So maybe I'll first go to you and share this question from the chat, and also the Q&A. Just give me 1 second, I'll pull it up here. One of the questions here was, let me just pull it up. Many questions. So I just want to say people are very engaged. This has been great to see. So one of the questions from Peggy Lee was around, again, just thanking around the BC Human Rights Commission report on disaggregated data from grandmother's perspective. And her question is, what recommendations for nonprofit orgs and service providers to begin disaggregated data collection and ensuring governance of data? So what advice is there for nonprofits who want to participate in this type of work?
Thanks for the question. It's the primary recommendations in the report are aimed at government, but that doesn't mean that there aren't lots of applicable lessons for other organizations of all kinds. And one of them, I think, is really to think of the spectrum of community involvement and understand that we're talking about a level of community engagement that is far along that spectrum towards control. So really, we can institute that through this legislative framework that we propose to government, or you can institute that through a small organization and building in governance structures to decide from the very beginning, not just how data is used at the end, but how do we collect data? Is it necessary? Data isn't always necessary. It can be very important, as I outlined in my comments earlier, but the primary goal we're working towards here is systemic and substantive equality. So let's start with that. Is this the right tool in this moment? If it is, who's directly impacted? What do they feel about this data and how it should be collected, how it should be stored, how it should be released, and how it should be used? And those questions you can ask and build in a scalable way from a small organization all the way up to the provincial government. So I'd encourage you to think about it in that way. And I just wanted to add something to the conversation before. I so appreciate the emphasis that Angela and Faye have brought to implementing recommendations. And I think it's a key piece of our gaze as a feminist community, as a progressive community, those working on these issues. I'm increasingly thinking about the role of symbolism and how we need to put that role in its place, if I can say it that way, that there's an important role for symbolism in the words we use and the language we use, but we can't let that be all consuming, that we have to move beyond words because that torch has been taken up across the political spectrum. There's a lot of words being used and little action and commitment sometimes on actually implementing that. We fought so hard, so many fought so hard for the Missing and Murdered Women Inquiry. We have a report. And what do we do with that? How do we make that real? And many of the commitments or the recommendations in the report are fairly huge and aspirational. So let's move to the next step. How do we make that real? How do we implement those very broad recommendations around housing and around sexual assault law and all of those pieces into real, tactical, tangible solutions that people can experience in their everyday lives? And that requires deep institutional change. To go back to your question, Angela, a few minutes ago about how do we actually do this, it requires some key institutional shifts. I think about that, I'll stop in a second, but I think about that in the context of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and how that's being brought into law in BC. Big celebrations around being brought into law, which was very important, an important moment, an important symbol of the shifting tides on colonization, but there are very important steps that need to happen next. And that's often when once we had the celebration, it kind of left many people's minds. And then we have had some major crises and moments of conflict, and the government hasn't gone back to that piece of legislation that it passed to say, what does this actually mean? Now that we have to actually do the hard work of figuring out what this means in real life. And I think as activists and as those working in the field, we have to keep our gaze on that side of the spectrum to make sure it actually happens.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that point around that vigilance, because the work is not over. The work must continue. The work needs to continue to ensure that we move beyond words to actual change and that enforcement of rights. And maybe with that in mind, I'll ask Michèle this question, just based on the previous question you answered around the mechanisms. So there's a question here from Kath who raises, we've seen how vulnerable renters are in the pandemic, and also just really appreciating the focus on housing as a human right in this panel. And Kath continues, housing rentals don't allow the social, emotional, and financial investment necessary to create stable homes and communities. How do we support housing equity and enable wealth creation for people experiencing homelessness and low-income citizens, residents? And so, just asking, is it tax incentives? Is it community-led housing development? Like, what can we do? Any thoughts on that front?
I probably have too many thoughts for the amount of time I have, but that's a really excellent question. I'm going to start here. I think COVID has really shown us how broken our housing system is. I think again and again, we've seen situations where some of the worst outbreaks we've seen are often related to housing and how we house people, what we think is appropriate. I think that in the context of renters and the housing rights that people have been coming up against, I think this was very clear in the context of evictions. Across the country, the way that we saw provinces and territories dealing with eviction moratoria or potential arrears programs. I can say in my work, talking about the right to housing, the deep frustration that I feel, and I know that rights claimants feel and partners feel, in the finger pointing that happens between the federal government and subnational governments like provinces and territories to say, no, it's your job to fix this evictions problem. It's your job to have a moratorium or arrears program or something like that. And through some of the research I've done as well, it's become very clear to me that some of the programs we have through things like the National Housing Strategy just aren't cutting it. I don't think that anyone is going to be surprised by that in any way, but there is a real clarity that investing in corporate owners to build more real estate, to create supply without monitoring affordability guidelines or who is accessing housing just isn't working. We all know that. This is like the tip of some of the stuff we're talking about today. And what I think is really transformative is what I'm excited about with the National Housing Strategy Act and the new mechanisms is it allows us a way to talk about all of these policy pieces related to housing, but in a really different way, related to housing and what is the right to housing, what are international human rights, what do they tell us? They tell us things like ending homelessness isn't just a nice thing to do, or it is a human rights obligation. We have to do that within an immediate goal. It's an immediate priority for us. It tells us that the investments that we're making in the impact of women in housing, and particularly intersectional women, in particular Indigenous women, just aren't cutting it to a standard of maximum of available resources, which is the standard in international human rights law. And I think it's really interesting. Often when talking about human rights and the right to housing, it does feel in some spaces almost academic and out of reach and out there and not very concrete. And I think a lot of that is up to us as advocates and people on the ground to make it real for communities, to make it real in terms of moving forward the things that we know need to happen to close the systemic gaps that exist. I was thinking a lot, Anjum, as you sent out some of our questions, and just thinking about this, the way that the right to housing and human rights changes some of these conversations. There have been a lot of chat and reflecting on the question a bit here, but about financialization of housing and over speculation of housing, knowing that we have set up a system where some real estate providers have a business model that is dependent on evicting low-income tenants, often women, and having high turnover in units. And I was in a conversation not long ago about financialization of housing, and it was posed that we really need to balance the interest of real estate investment trusts, of real estate corporations, and the rights claimants who are being evicted. And that is wild. Like, why do we approach these issues with that framework of let's balance this? And the reason is that economic and social rights have been relegated. They aren't something we prioritize, because if we have that conversation instead in the context of human rights and international human rights law and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, we start with the rights claimant and we talk about the violation and we talk about the way that international human rights law applies, and then we get to the recommendation. And it also urges implementation, just like Angela was talking about, right, with the inquiry report. What an excellent example of a report that uses human rights, that uses a rights-based approach, that has strong rights recommendations in it, that's now sitting on a shelf. So how do we as advocates, as a movement, support each other and support especially the voices of those who are the most marginalized, especially Indigenous women, to make sure that their voices are heard in claiming those rights and making them real, and bringing together these strong policy recommendations into this rights-based space so that it changes the way and really moves us forward, and moves us forward as we're pushing different levels of government to be listening to this message.
Thank you, Michèle. And just thank you again for highlighting how do we actually make this real. I think this is actually what this panel has done here today. So I just want to thank each and every one of you, our panelists, our organizing partners, our presenting partners, for having this conversation. I think this is going to be a really important conversation for us as we go into the budget season, as we go into a potential election. I think one of the things that has been a realization for me from this conversation, we touched on so many different human rights issues, but I think, you know, Michèle, to the point that you made, how do we make this central? How do we ensure that human rights is not something that's nice to have, but deeply essential? And I think each one of you has really highlighted that point. So I want to first again say thank you to everyone. We have had such a rich discussion, so we are a bit over time, but I think it was well worth it. And I look forward to future conversations. With that, I'd like to thank you all from everyone who made this event possible, and looking forward to more conversations. So thank you again, everyone, and have take good care and see you soon. Bye, everyone.